Good evening, everyone, and thank you for listening to the Futurati podcast, where we dive into how emerging technologies will impact the world and your bank account. I'm Trent Fowler, and joining me as always is my co-host, Thomas Fry. Thomas and I are futurists, keynote speakers, and consultants with decades of experience in analyzing trends and communicating new developments to audiences across the world. Reach out to us at futuratipodcast.com/contact-futurati if you'd like to hire us for consulting, to speak at your event, or to advertise on our podcast. Thomas, we just wrapped up a monster interview with Dr. Stephen Hsu.
Yeah, well, the most important thing that he taught me is how to regrow hair on my head. And so I think there's a lot of people out there that want to know about this.
Yeah. On the other hand, we spent a lot of time talking about genetics and intelligence. So I think we might piss some people off.
Right. Well, yeah, he said that's almost guaranteed.
That's almost guaranteed. Hey,
Yeah.
You know what? I'm always in favor of just telling the truth and getting at the science and letting the chips fall where they may.
I think we're going to have smarter people in the future to deal with all the problems that we're creating today.
Well, Einstein did say you can't solve a problem at the same level of intelligence that went into creating it. And it turns out that Dr. Hsu, who has a great deal of intelligence, is thinking a lot about how to make human beings smarter.
Yeah. Yeah. And he's saying that some young ladies can actually produce as many as 60 to 100 eggs at a time.
Yeah, this was one of those episodes that was just filled with little facts that were really remarkable. And then I was just like, that can't be true. That's crazy.
Yeah. So I would like to see that lady take care of 60 kids at a
time. No, that's pretty remarkable, though. So the basic technology is you can have 60 or 100 embryos, you can fertilize them all and do some fairly advanced by the standards of yesteryear, but pretty basic by the standards of today analysis on them. And tell things like how tall this child's going to be and
right.
what their propensity for obesity or diabetes or things are, with a degree of accuracy that I did not think was possible. And we got into the question of epigenetics and how much of it, how much data you actually need to do these things. Epigenetics is a much smaller factor than I realized, and the data requirements are just not that big. So I think that we could be at the dawn of a new age of genetic engineering, and one that I think holds a lot of promise. And
yeah, I just realized now that I forgot to ask him about werewolves, which doesn't fit into this equation at all.
And it was such a high priority. My burning werewolf questions will now go unanswered. God damn it. Hey, well, we should have an entire episode just on that, though.
Just on werewolves. Yeah.
Well, we hope you enjoy this episode with Dr. Stephen Hsu, and please don't forget to like and subscribe to the podcast. Share it with your friends. It's the best way to help us grow. And
this one, he is incredibly intelligent.
Yeah.
He zeroes in on these facts, and I was blown away.
He has a real way of getting to it. I mean, it's theoretical physicist, computational genomics, AI, and ML. It's casts a pretty wide net. So as I was saying, please reach out to us to let us know what you like and don't like, and enjoy this episode. Since the discovery of genetics, people have dreamed of being able to correct diseases, select traits in children before birth, and build better human beings. Naturally, many serious technical and ethical questions surround this endeavor. Luckily, tonight's guest is as good a guide as we could hope to have. Dr. Steve Hsu is professor of theoretical physics and of computational mathematics, science, and engineering at Michigan State University. He has done extensive research in the field of computational genomics and is the founder of several startups. We're live on road. We're ready to go. Dr. Hsu, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Hey, it's my pleasure.
Why don't we hear a little bit about your background, your interests, and what brought you to working on the many problems you're working on today?
Well, I grew up in Ames, Iowa, so I'm a Midwestern kid. And from a fairly young age, I wanted to be a theoretical physicist. My hero was a guy called Richard Feynman. And I actually followed pretty closely in his footsteps because my main field of interest in theoretical physics, high energy physics, particle physics, cosmology, those are really related to the things that he worked on.
So I saw the picture of you with him, and
yes.
That's kind of a classic photo. What kind of person was he? Can you just give us a little insight into his personality?
Well, he was very, very friendly and open to students. He loved talking to students. He was endlessly curious and, of course, had an incredibly keen intelligence. And one of the things he's famous for is if there's something that you were an expert in that he got interested in, he would come over and just focus in on you like a laser beam and suck all the information out. And he loved to reason from first principles and from basic intuition. He would always want to have some kind of picture of what was going on, and kind of a very visual thinker. And so very unique intelligence. I mean, he worked on so many different things. He worked on particle physics, of course, and quantum mechanics, but he also worked on the idea of quantum computers really came from him. And he, toward the end of his life, there are even some talks he gave on AGI, artificial intelligence, things like this. So he had very, very broad interests. Actually, he even worked in molecular biology.
And what was it him that wrote the there's plenty of room at the bottom? So he suggested nanotechnology in the beginning as
yes, well? Also nanotechnology. Yeah, I forgot about that. He had an ongoing challenge to all the engineers in all the defense firms around Southern California, because they would often, these firms like Hughes and they were often staffed by a lot of Caltech graduates, and he was a professor at Caltech. So he would go there and give lectures, and he would challenge them to build, like, I think he would give X dollars, I don't know, $1,000 prize to whoever built the smallest working, motor, or the smallest, I forgot all the different things that he challenged people to build, but then the engineers would try to construct these little tiny things and build them. And so he was famous for saying that there's a lot of room at the bottom to continue to miniaturize things. And of course, people don't realize it, but modern semiconductor technology is effectively a realization of that dream, because you're now getting to feature sizes in the nanometer range or a few nanometer range. And we are actually building really super complex structures, but where the individual feature size is down at the nanometer level.
That's remarkable. I'd never considered it through that lens before. Sorry, we interrupted you with the Feynman story about your background, but you followed in his footsteps. You were interested in cosmology and some of the same questions. So pick up there.
Yeah. So most of my adult life, I've been working as a theoretical physicist. And in that way, that by itself is unusual in its own way, but there are thousands of theoretical physicists around the world. And for most of my career, I've pretty much been one of them. But I guess a couple places where I diverged from what typical theoretical physicists do is, one, I founded several tech startups along the way. Mm-hmm. So starting in the late 90s, my first startup was in information security and encryption technology. But I have a background in technology startups. And then the other thing that I've done recently, just in the last roughly 10 or 12 years of my life, I've been doing a lot of work in AI and machine learning applied to genomics. So applied to the problem of, given the DNA of an organism, and I mainly work on humans, but given the DNA of an organism, what can you say about the actual traits, complex traits of that organism? Could you look at the DNA of a person and tell what eye color he has? Can you tell how tall that person is? Can you tell whether he's going to get diabetes? Can you tell whether he is above average or below average intelligence? Those are all problems that we've made incredible progress on just in the last few years, mainly because of the availability of huge amounts of data.
Okay, well, we were going to spend some time talking about that because I'm an ML guy myself. So
yeah.
We tend to get into the genomic stuff rather a lot. So I'm going to let Thomas start off because he's got got some ideas. He's got some thoughts.
I've been speculating on the designer baby issue, in that it's going to start off with a wave of things that we can do with unborn kids to eliminate genetic defects that the parents might have. And then I think it'll start expanding from there. Is that close to your read as well?
Well, not just my read, but what we're actually doing.
Okay.
At my company, Genomic Prediction. So just tell me how much detail you want to get into, but within the IVF industry, so people that are doing in vitro fertilization, it's already common for embryos to be genetically tested before the decision is made which of the multiple embryos typically that a couple has at their disposal, which of those will actually be used to become their baby. So there's already pretty advanced genetic screening in place. And in fact, what my company does uniquely is we can characterize the whole genome of the individual embryo, and we can compute point predictions for the risk that that particular embryo has for about 20 different common disease conditions. And we even compute an overall health index for how healthy that baby would be eventually.
So how long will it be before a pregnant lady can go into her genetic engineering doctor and have a checklist of things that she can check off? I want this, I want that, and no, I don't want these three here, but yeah, I want this kid to be 6'3" and weigh just 180 pounds when he grows up.
Well, if you say the lady is already pregnant,
yeah,
then that's quite a challenging proposition, because editing or modifying the baby that she's already carrying is quite difficult. However, if you say the couple is in an IVF clinic,
okay,
and as a consequence of an IVF cycle, they have 10 frozen embryos, and my company has genotyped all 10 of those embryos, and they get an electronic report telling them, you know, which one is the one that has the highest, which, if any of them are outliers for diabetes risk, or outliers for breast cancer risk, or outliers for schizophrenia risk. That's in the report, and they use that information to select which of those 10 embryos to use. That's already a reality. The first baby born who had been polygenically screened in this way, the way that I just described, while she was still an embryo, that baby was born in 2020. So,
oh, wow.
So we have not been slacking off. we've been pushing the frontier forward.
Yeah, let's hear a little bit about how that process works. So I know I looked into this, I don't know, 8 or 10 years ago, and iterative embryo selection was one of the plausible pathways forward for building a superhuman intelligence. It was one of the ones that they were discussing alongside an algorithm, is you make humans that are actually smarter through this process. And it seems like remarkable amounts of progress have been made in the intervening years. So what does that look like in terms of, I mean, get into as much detail as you want.
I want to clarify that although we can do some level of prediction of cognitive ability from DNA alone, and I can go into a whole sidetrack of at what level we can do that prediction, and et cetera, et cetera. But let me just say that our company does not offer that because it's too controversial. So the only information that we give the families about the embryos from the genetic information that we derive has to do with health risks, and as I said, an overall health index. Our calculations suggest that if you have 10 embryos and you pick the one with the best health index versus random selection, you're gaining about 4 life years for that. Whichever one becomes your child will end up on average having about 4 extra healthy years of life than if you just randomly selected one. So that's the value proposition. We're trying to stay away from the most controversial traits like cognitive ability, like height, like eye color, cosmetic traits. We're only doing the ones that really have an impact on health. So I just want to clarify that. Now, for people who are not familiar with IVF, let me just quickly go through it. So this is typically used by couples that have a fertility issue. Okay, typically, very commonly, the wife is older. And just recently in most Western countries, the average age at first marriage for women exceeded 30. And biologically, fertility decline in women typically takes place in their early to mid 30s. So you can see right there, there's a narrow window now for majority of Western women to have the baby before they start to have fertility issues. If they have fertility issues, they may end up in an IVF clinic. In the IVF process, in vitro fertilization process, some hormones are given to the mother-to-be. They stimulate her ovarian reserve so that in her cycle, instead of releasing one egg, she releases a much larger number. If she's an older woman, it might be 5 eggs, it might be 10 eggs. If she's young, I recently learned it could be 60 or 100 eggs.
Oh, wow.
And that would be for like a 22-year-old woman in the prime of health. Okay. Right. So typically those are egg donors. But some number of eggs are produced. There's an easy extraction. It's a nurse that does it. It's not even, doesn't even require a surgeon or anything like that. They're just a needle comes in and then they extract the eggs. And then the eggs are fertilized outside the woman's body. So that's in vitro. And they're allowed to develop. And they just develop on their own. You know, 1 cell becomes 2 cells, becomes 4 cells. And when they're about 100 cells, a small biopsy is taken. That small biopsy comes from something called the trophectoderm, which is the part of the embryo which is going to become the placenta. It has the same DNA as the child, but it's not actually the child from whom the cells come from. Those few cells, the DNA in those few cells can be amplified to the point where we can get a whole genotype, whole genome genotype of that particular embryo. Then those embryos are frozen in liquid nitrogen. Freezing and thawing these little tiny molecular machines does not seem to harm them in any way, as far as we can tell. It gives the mother some time for her body to recover from the hormone stimulation. It turns out that improves the probability of a successful implantation. In the meantime, they will get the genetic report. The genetic report tells them all kinds of things. The most basic stuff has to do with chromosome structure, whether there's an extra copy of a chromosome, which might lead to Down syndrome. That's the basic information. The more advanced information has to do with these polygenic traits that I described. They have plenty of time to look at that report, to talk to genetic counselors, to talk to their IVF physician, make a decision that we're going to use embryo number 5. And then a month later or so, or 2 months later, or even 10 years later, depending on what happens, the woman comes in, the embryo is thawed, and then it's implanted. And then if things go well, then a pregnancy ensues and a baby is born. Now, in the United States, so first of all, in most Western countries, 3 to 5% of all babies born today come through the process I just described. Okay.
Wow. That's much higher than I would have guessed.
Yeah. So if you go to a kindergarten and just look around, you'll see some IVF kids. Okay. In Denmark, in which they have nationalized healthcare and IVF is covered in the healthcare. So it's, I don't know if it's completely free, but it's virtually free, certainly compared to the United States. Mm-hmm. And also women have a high degree of, freedom to choose their careers. In Denmark, 10% of all babies born are born through IVF today. Okay, so you can see where this is going. It's becoming a more and more commonly performed procedure, more and more common way for the next generation to be born. And consequently, millions of embryos are genotyped every year. And in the United States, about, I think 60 to 70% of all embryos produced are at least screened, at least genotyped for chromosome screening, if not the more advanced thing that we do. So that's the basics.
So how long before we get the ability to actually create a super smart child?
I was going to ask you
the Richard Feynman type.
Some related questions. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned at the outset that you don't do that because it's controversial. You didn't say you can't do it because it's not possible. So I guess as a starter question, so you could genotype these kids and like, how accurate could you be with that? I mean, could you pinpoint the IQ with a lot of accuracy, or just ballpark it 2 sigma above the mean kind of thing?
Yeah. So the current best predictors for cognitive ability, and just to make a parenthetical comment, which we can pick up later, the limitation on the quality of prediction is almost entirely due to the limited amount of data we have to analyze. So it could improve quite a bit more.
Right.
In the case of height, our prediction, the standard error of our prediction is roughly an inch. So for people who grow up in good environments and have plenty to eat and good, nutrition, exercise, sleep, their height is basically determined by genetics, and we can predict it roughly plus or minus an inch. With IQ, it's not, because we have less data. The algorithms have less data to work with to build a predictor. we are nowhere near optimal prediction for IQ. And roughly speaking, the cognitive score correlates about 0.3 to 0.4 with the actual IQ score that was measured by the individual. This is in validation tests of the best predictors. So that's enough to warn you if you have a negative outlier. So if you have 10 embryos and one of them is a real outlier, you might just say, I'm a little worried, I'm not going to use that one. Or the other way, if one is a positive outlier, you might say, hey, I have a good chance with that one. But it's nowhere near this plus or minus 1 inch level of precision that we have for height. Although I believe, roughly speaking, if we could get to the point where we have about 1 million individual genomes with good, well-characterized IQ or cognitive scores for each of those individuals, the predictor trained on that data would be able to predict cognitive ability, maybe plus or minus 10 points.
That's pretty remarkable. And is that because it's more polygenic? I don't know as much about the genetics, but and I have some questions about epigenetics too and how that plays into all this. But is it just because with IQ you're dealing with something that's more distributed across the genome as opposed to height, and that it's less determined in that way?
No, in both cases, the genetic architecture, both for height and for IQ, they're very, very similar. So they're both controlled, we can already tell, by a border of 10,000 individual genetic variants or loci in the genome. So your genome is 3 billion base pairs, and only about a few tens of thousands of those individual locations are controlling the variation in height and the variation in cognitive ability. Now, tens of thousands seems like a lot to some people, like, oh, that's a pretty complicated predictor. It depends on 10,000 variables. On the other hand, as a fraction of the total variation in the human genome, it's a small fraction of the total variation in the human genome. So you can look at it one of two different ways. The genetic architecture, as far as we can tell, of height is very similar in the sense that it's polygenic and pretty much uniformly distributed across all your chromosomes. The locations of little variants that have some small plus or minus effect on your height or your cognitive ability. And by the way, everything I'm telling you was only known in the last 5 years. It was only in the last 5 years that we reached sufficient data and sufficiently good algorithms that people like me could study that and build predictors and figure out the genetic architecture of all these traits. And now if you talk to, there's probably a population of maybe a few thousand computational geneticists in the world who, are experts in machine learning and stuff, statistical genetics and things like that. Within that small community, people are very up on the results that I just explained to you, but it's a pretty small community. It's not understood even to most medical, I would say 99% of medical doctors don't understand any of this. It's certainly not taught in any med school that I know of.
So if you listen to our podcast, you're officially smarter than your doctor. That's the takeaway from this episode.
You definitely know a few things about the frontiers of human
genetics. Yeah.
They're not taught in medical school yet. They're not in medical school textbooks yet.
So 10 years from now, how many controls do you anticipate the average doctor having in kind of affecting the outcome of this unborn child?
Well, okay. So remember, at the moment, we're not talking about modifying any particular embryo, but we are talking about choosing
its selection,
which embryo to use. And selection already happens. So it's already the case that these couples, even if they decide not to do any genetic testing, they will end up making a choice. Now, the question is, are you making a random choice or are you making an informed choice? That's the difference. In 10 years, I would anticipate that IVF will be much more common. Maybe in the US, 15% of babies or something will be born, 10% of babies will be born using IVF. And I think it'll be very, very common for those couples to be looking at a pretty sophisticated genetic report on each embryo in order to make the decision of which one becomes their child.
I'm curious about the data problem. So you said that you have an error measure of about 1 inch plus or minus for height, but for IQ, you've got a 0.3 or 0.4 correlation roughly.
Correct.
And yet the genetic architectures are very similar. and it's controlled by roughly 10,000 loci that are evenly distributed across all the different the points. So why is it the case that you can't predict IQ with as much accuracy, and you would need more data for that? If they sound like pretty similar data problems to me.
Right, but you have more data. You have more labeled data, where labeling means you have the genome and you have the phenotype, which is height. You have more labeled data where one of the labels is height than you do where one of the labels is the SAT score or the Stanford Binet IQ score. You just don't have as much labeled cognitive data. That's the problem.
Okay, so is that just because IQ testing is not all that common?
It's actually, almost everybody in America who goes to college takes what is, they don't like to admit it, but it is actually an IQ test, something like the SAT or the ACT. I can map your SAT score to a reasonable approximation of your what's called your IQ score. Now, that is not actually the limit, the problem. The problem is that for reasons of political correctness, there are far left people who are very, very opposed to the idea that I could analyze your DNA and then predict your cognitive ability. They actually, it's almost a religious belief on their part that cannot be true. What I'm telling you, what I told you in the last 10 minutes, it just has to be all lies. Even though it's, there have been hundreds of papers published by statistical geneticists and computational geneticists on this exact problem, okay? No one is claiming we've completely cracked height because of this data problem, but we have cracked height. I'm sorry, we have not cracked cognitive ability, but we have cracked height, okay? But even what is conventionally believed by most of the frontier level researchers who work on genomic prediction or polygenic prediction about cognitive ability, none of that is acceptable. If you go into a sociology department at any university, 9 out of 10 of those sociologists will violently attack you.
Right.
Just for pointing, I could hold up a paper that was on the cover of Nature, and I can say Nature Genetics, and I can say, you see this paper, and then you'll be attacked. I actually know this from personal experience.
Right.
Now,
you have some experience with this, as it turns out.
Now, as a consequence of that, there are literally $0 of your tax money being spent by NIH or NSF to understand the genetics of human intelligence. Wow. There are billions of dollars spent by NSF and NIH to understand the genetics of, acid reflux, celiac disease, you name it. But the most important thing that differentiates humans from animals is not understudied, and it's 100% for political reasons.
Wow.
That's awesome.
And I'll even give you a very, very impactful medical reason why it should be studied. All of us have relatives who, when they get older, suffer cognitive decline. They might suffer Alzheimer's, early onset Alzheimer's, dementia, memory loss. My in-laws actually are going through this right now, so it's very close to home for me. Now, if you wanted to study genetic predisposition and perhaps cures for some of these conditions, you would want time series cognitive scores for these people, along with their genomics. But no, are we doing that? Are we doing that at any kind of scale? No, we're not. And it's very politically sensitive. Because once you start measuring those quantities, people get really nervous. Actually, they can get very aggressive and angry. So anyway, but the answer to your machine learning question is we have much less labeled data of the type we want to solve problem A than for solving problem B. Consequently, we completely solved. My lab in 2017 solved height. We gave predictors that had accuracy roughly 1 inch for height. The cognitive ability thing has to date not been solved, but as I said, we're creeping along. We have predictors that correlate about 0.3 or 0.4 with the actual cognitive score.
I wanted to ask you a question about epigenetics and how that plays in. So there's this emerging field, and this is for the audience's benefit, not for yours. I'm sure you know all this already, but there's this emerging field of research called epigenetics, which studies the interface between the environment and how genes are turned on or off. So it's not necessarily the case that you have the static genome, and that's just determines all your phenotypic characteristics throughout your life. It's also the case that depending on the environment you grow up in, some of them can be turned off or modulated in various ways. And it's surprising to me that height is so well determined by the genomic structure, and intelligence as well is shaping up to be as determined in the same way. So how do epigenetics factor into that? Do you account for that at all, or does it just not?
Yeah, let me back up and just mention to you that if I take two identical twins who at birth, they were torn apart and never saw each other again. And one was raised by coal miners and the other was raised by two university professors. Okay. There have been literally thousands of papers written by psychologists, behavior geneticists on the correlation or similarity of those two twins who may have never met. So whatever epigenetic things happened to them after they were born, one drank a lot of Coca-Cola, the other one lived in a house where there was no sugar allowed at all. Nevertheless, on average, the correlation between their IQ scores is extremely high. It's as high as their correlation in height. And they typically, two identical twins raised in different environments, as long as they're good environments, will typically differ in height by less than maybe half an inch on average. Okay. So it is true there are epigenetic effects, but lots of what you read about epigenetic effects is hype. And if you actually just open up a textbook, I mean, this is actually in textbooks. If you open up a textbook to the chapter on twin studies, and then you think about, well, the epigenetics must be slightly different because one of these twins grew up in a different family, and one of them was exposed to, more sunlight and the other less sunlight. One had a dog and the other one didn't have. The epigenetics must be different. Well, how come they're so similar? So the point is there are epigenetic effects, but they're not nearly as large as you've been led to believe. And, you can look at actual data to decide what you think is a rough estimate of the size of these epigenetic effects.
Do you think that's because people are sort of desperate for a counter narrative where if we just structured society the correct way, the genetic effects would be washed out and we'd be reborn in the light of the state or whatever?
People are very, very frightened of the possibility that you and I are molecular machines, and some aspects of our molecular machinery, oh, gee, I start as one cell and there's some information, some genetic code in that one cell. And it's actually, wow, it's present in every cell. Some people are very worried that that molecular machinery has some basic operating code that makes one human different from another human. People are very afraid of that, as opposed to I'm different from you because of my own free will and what my mom fed me for breakfast when I was 12. They, for some reason, much prefer the latter narrative than the idea that the molecular machinery controls things. But they've never studied because they avert their eyes like this whenever someone does a detailed twin or adoption study. Adopted children who maybe never met their birth parents resemble their birth parents much more in IQ, height, income, law abidingness than they resemble their adoptive parents. This is a very standard result that's been studied with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of adopted children that have been carefully tracked through their lives. This is all well known. If you go to any university in the country and you go to the psychology department and you say, point me to the office of the people, the subgroup in your department that study behavior genetics. Okay, and there'll be maybe 2 or 3 professors there who study behavior genetics, and they know all the twins literature back and forth. They know all the adoption studies back and forth. And you knock on their door and you ask them these questions. They'll just explain to you what I just explained to you. But those people are under constant attack, even from the other psychologists down the hall who don't like what they have to say.
Yeah. Are you enjoying this episode of the Futurati podcast? If so, please like it. Give the show a 5-star rating on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and share it with your friends. By far, the best way to help us grow is to spread the word on social media, which will expose our content to more people and help us continue to bring you interviews with world-leading experts in AI, quantum computing, cryptocurrencies, and so much more. Thank you in advance. Well, let's get into that a little bit then. So, I mean, how do you think about the ethics of all these things? And I'm thinking, in particular about the process of selecting the embryos. And I mean, I don't like the phrase playing God, but let's just go ahead and use it. I mean, all of human history is really the story of us accreting greater degrees of control over our environments internally and externally. And so I don't really have a problem with it, but even I will admit there's something vaguely creepy about pulling down an app from the app store and like choosing your kid's eyes. And I know we're some way away from that, but
as for the eyes, we're only away from that because we don't do it, but we can do it. We can tell you the eye color of each kid. We can tell you whether they have light skin or dark skin. We can tell you lots of things already, but we don't do it because of this discomfort that you mentioned.
It's problematic. So I'm very pro science and pro progress, and so I don't really have a problem with most of these things. But you must have given it some thought, like where it would be appropriate to stop, or whether or not this might open gaps between the people who can afford these things and the people that can't afford these things, and that whole realm. So how do you think about those issues?
Yes, so we've had very lively conversations and debates on these issues within our company, within Genomic Prediction, the company, within my research lab and among our collaborators, and then more broadly within the set of people who do computational genomics. And people are going to come down in different places on it. My own feeling is that right now, as a company, what we're focusing on is the health issues, because there's already a precedent for, in some cases, the health issue of genetic disease is controlled just by a single mutation. And society has already decided that it's okay to screen embryos against those single dangerous mutations, or extra copy of chromosome 21, which gives you Down syndrome. Okay, so society's already said, like, okay, for those things, which were the sort of most simplistic aspects of genetics that were figured out first, it is okay to screen, right? That's the collective decision. Then if I say, okay, fine, I'm going to go with what you said, things that have very serious health impacts, okay to screen against, I will just develop a much better tool, which doesn't just rely on very big, gross chromosomal changes, but no, it actually integrates effects over all 10,000 variants and calculates the height. Okay, we don't do height, but calculates the breast cancer risk. Okay, so we feel like we're just giving a better technical tool to solve a problem that society already said you can solve, which is prevent health problems by allowing the couple to pick which embryo they're going to use. Okay, so that's a very small step. It's just a very big improvement in technology, but a very small step in terms of ethical analysis. Of course, if you go to any bioethicist, they're very up in arms about this stuff. They're writing millions of papers either for or against embryo screening, polygenic embryo screening. But from my perspective, we are merely providing a better way to carry out what was already being done for single gene mutations like Tay-Sachs or cystic fibrosis, et cetera. Now, when it comes to things like cognitive ability, or we're going to be able to predict the actual facial morphology of someone from their DNA. The fact that two twins look almost the same tells you that the facial morphology is under genetic control, and therefore it's all just a data problem for us to actually be able to say, okay, given this DNA, this is what the face is going to look like at age 3. This is what it's going to look like at age 10. We can already, theoretically, we know we can do that. We just don't have the data yet to do it. Now,
so can you also do the propensity for obesity and for, human strength and things like that?
So we don't have a lot of labeled data for human strength. We do have a lot of labeled data for obesity, and we can predict propensity for obesity.
Okay.
And it is a difficult question for us whether to include propensity for obesity in the report, because when we do our testing of the matrix of traits that affect longevity and long-term adult health, obesity is in there. So if you're obese, you're much more likely to be diabetic. If you're obese, you're much more likely to have heart disease. If you're obese, you're much like, so the question is, well, should we include it? Some people would say we're, I don't know what the right word is, body sizist or BMIist for, you guys are laughing, but in the current environment, that's how people react to this. But on the other hand, we can see that the same genetic factors that influence your obesity risk are influencing your diabetes risk and heart disease risk and blood pressure risk and all these other things. So it's very tough for us not to eventually include that in our overall health index evaluation of each embryo.
This is absolutely fascinating, because you're touching on all the things that the average person on the street has no ideas going on in the background, that there's all these gray areas that you can't talk about. There's some rule book out there that hasn't officially been written yet, but
appears to change rather a lot. And, is selectively applied. How do you feel about the question of a gap between, or like divergence in human evolution over time, where if this technology remains very expensive, Elon Musk's kids will all have IQs of 195, whereas my children will be far more modest. Do you think that the cost of the technology will be driven down such that it's actually in reach for most people, or to be part of standard healthcare packages? Or does the argument actually have legs and it's something worth worrying about?
It is something worth worrying about. Now, I want to say that the fundamental cost of these procedures is very low. So, for example, I emphasize that when you do the egg extraction, it's not even a surgeon that's required to do it. A nurse can actually do it, right? So if you look at IVF, if you break it down, like give some hormone shots, retrieve eggs, lab tech does something with the eggs, biopsy is taken, gene sequencers, which are cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, genotype the embryos, bits are computed in the AWS servers,
right?
PDF is emailed to the genetic counselor and the IVF physician. I'm literally describing what our company does. Now, no step there is expensive. Rents are extracted by doctors in America.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But if you go for the same procedure in South Korea or Taiwan, it costs a fraction of the cost and it could be more effective. Okay. And same thing in Europe. So there's nothing intrinsically expensive about what I'm describing as a method of reproduction. And an enlightened country like Denmark or like Israel, both of which provide these as part of their national healthcare systems, can make it quite cost effective. And if I just decrease significant, if you look at our results in our papers, the amount of risk reduction of major diseases in embryos that have been selected in this way it's way down. So the cost benefit analysis over a lifetime is hugely positive for that healthcare system. Okay. So there's no reason why it can't be scaled and made available to the whole population. Will that actually happen in, the home of the brave? What are we? The home of the brave,
land of the free.
Yeah. I'm not sure it's going to happen here. Here we may have wild inequality where, Donald Trump's grandchildren are, 6'6" and look like NBA basketball players and have IQs of 200 and life expectancies of 200 years. That if there's anywhere that's going to happen, it's in the United States of America. But I think other countries will get it right.
No reason our inequality can't be bigger than everybody else's.
Why not? We're number one.
USA. Hello, this is Trent Fowler, co-host of the Futurati podcast. One of the most common pieces of marketing advice I've come across is to know your audience and give them what they want. One difficulty in podcasting is that it's actually pretty hard to do this. None of the major platforms give us any way to reach out to you, our listeners, to find out what you enjoy about the Futurati podcast and what you'd like to see done differently. So we've decided to record this commercial and ask you directly to reach out to us. Head over to futuratipodcast.com, go to the contact page, and drop us a line. Tell us about your favorite and least favorite episodes, what you'd like to see us cover in the future, and anything else you want us to know. We produce this show for you, and we want your advice so we can make it even better. Thank you. So let's nerd out. Well, okay, so it's almost 40 minutes. Let's not nerd out too much, but I am sort of interested in the ML piece. You're talking about labeled data, so it sounds like a relatively straightforward supervised learning problem. Can you talk a little bit about the algorithms you're using to do this kind of thing and what the data collection looks like?
Absolutely. And if I nerd out too far, stop me, okay?
I don't think we've ever hit that yet.
So it's supervised learning. You hold back a sample for validation. And in fact, typically we have out of sample validation where we might train on this data set Maybe the data set is all people from the United States, but then we'll validate on people who grew up in the UK or Germany or Australia, so that we're actually effectively randomizing over environments and all that stuff. So, and in the thousands of papers that have been published in the last 5 years on this topic, you see results hold up extremely well. If you train in the UK and you try to apply your predictor in Canada or Australia or the United States, it works very well. So the process is to assemble a huge labeled training set. You're doing supervised learning. There's a particular set of algorithms that we use a lot, which use something called L1 penalization. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but the issue is the following. Although these are highly polygenic conditions, like I said, they may depend on 10,000 different loci in your genome. Nevertheless, those loci are sparsely distributed through your genome. The probability that any particular locus is involved in height is very low. It has a sizable effect on height is very low. Okay. So if you incorporate in a Bayesian way the prior that the predictor you're trying to build is sparse, you need an algorithm that enforces that sparsity. And so we use what are called L1 penalized algorithms, which favor sparsity. And so I don't know if I'm nerding out too much for you, but
yeah. Well, I was just going to ask why you like L1 over L2, because I mean you can regularize.
L2 doesn't favor sparsity.
It doesn't deal with outliers as well.
It doesn't. So when you optimize L1 in a hyperspace, in a high dimensional space, it tries to force individual effect sizes to 0, whereas L2 doesn't do that. L2 will you're just minimizing the L2 error. With an L1, you have an L2 error and you have an L1 penalization, and the L1 penalization will always try to shrink effect sizes to 0 if it can.
Because it's just the sum of the parameters, right? And so therefore, it's always going to try to get those to be small. Okay.
Yes, you have to pay a high price in improvement of fit in order to activate, to turn on any effect size.
That's a good way of putting it.
Gotcha. Yeah. Now, there are very deep mathematical theorems about, they're called, you could think of them as performance guarantees of, if you have a sparse model and you noise it up, so you have sparse model generates the output, and then you add noise to it. And then you ask, I'm making a bunch of measurements on that. I sample from that noisy data, and then I use an L1 algorithm to then try to reconstruct the original model. That's the mathematical description of the problem that we're actually solving. There are theorems which guarantee that given us, for a certain level of noise, which is related to the heritability of the trait. So the environmental stuff is all the noise, which is randomized over. For a certain, if you know the heritability of the trait or the noise level equivalently, using these theorems, I can predict how much labeled data I need to perfectly solve the problem. So in 2012, we wrote papers showing that human genomes were in a certain universality class that had been discovered for L1 penalized algorithms, and that these theorems would all apply to problems in genomics. And in those papers, we predicted that in order to solve height, you would need a few 100,000 labeled individuals. And indeed, as soon as a data set of that size became available in 2017, within a month, we had solved it and built the height predictor using these methods. So now you have to be a real nerd to care about this. You have to be an applied mathematician or someone who actually likes theoretical machine learning. Because if you think about what I just said, there are theorems which describe the performance of these algorithms. And we showed these theorems apply to problems in genomics. And we made a prediction for how much data would be needed to solve certain traits based just on their heritability. And we show that that was true. Now, not too many biologists understand what I just said, and not even too many genomicists understand what I just said. But I would say we deserve a big prize in Stockholm, because we predicted, from the physics standpoint, if I come as a theorist and I make a non-trivial theoretical prediction, and then later the experimental tests of the experimental physicist verifies my theoretical prediction, it's non-trivial and important, then usually you get a Nobel Prize. Now, in this case, it's kind of fallen between the cracks, like, because not very many people understand what I just said to you. But in the fullness of time, maybe people will figure it out. And in a way, it doesn't matter because we're applying this stuff every day now to embryos. So if people don't understand, so what? No, people don't understand how their microwave oven works, and people don't understand how their microchip works. It's working.
Right. Well, I mean, there could be a Turing Award in it for you, maybe.
Maybe if people figure it out. Yeah.
Well, you've been on the Futurati podcast, so I don't think you're not gonna top this. I don't think.
This is peak life experience.
So will it be possible sometime in the future for people to add pieces of DNA from another person to their unborn child?
Make chimeras?
To take some Nobel Prize winner and add their DNA to this child, give them an extra boost?
Yeah. So let me tell you, it's not necessary to take the DNA from another person, but if I figure out that at these 10,000 locations, these are the ones that are influencing your intelligence. And at each of those locations, I know which of the variants, is it an A, a C, G, if I know which letter of the DNA alphabet is the one that's good, I can go in and edit the DNA of an embryo and flip all the things into the favorable direction.
Okay.
And that's certainly possible. What we're waiting for is for the CRISPR is the name of the technology that's used to do this editing.
Right.
We're waiting for that gene editing technology to get better so that there are fewer off-target errors, so that you don't accidentally edit places you didn't mean to edit, and also so that you can edit many places simultaneously in a multiplex fashion. So those are the next steps in the development of that technology. And I would predict in 10 or 20 years, we're going to be there. So we can already do single gene edits very well. Okay. So, and we can, so we're already curing some diseases using single gene edits. Okay. Like sickle cell anemia. But go ahead.
Please. No.
So what I'm trying to say to you is once we know what we want to do, like, okay, if I wanted to make a human taller and I had a editing tool, which was very good, better than what we have now, but probably only 10 or 20 years away, I could just go in and flip the things and end up with a very, 7 foot, 8 foot tall person. Okay. And we could probably do that. I'm pretty certain we could do that with intelligence. Now, you mentioned like taking it from a person and sticking it in. Well, we don't have to do that. If we have enough examples of all people, so the algorithm can figure out what it needs to do, that's good enough. Right. Yeah. So we're kind of going in that direction. I think we're probably going to get there within, maybe 20 years or something. So
if the climate is favorable.
Yeah. If civilization doesn't collapse before then, I think we're
we're in a race. Are we going to achieve escape velocity or just collapse into nothing? That's sort of the race we're running right now.
Yeah. We have to invent the person that's going to save us. Right.
Some of my friends view my work as like a kind of hedge against AGI wiping us out, because if humans are better, we have a better chance of surviving when AGI comes along. Some of my friends think that the humans that make the breakthrough on AGI will be the genetically engineered super smart humans.
Yeah, so you could be hastening it or protecting us from it.
Yes.
There's just no good way to know.
No way to know.
I
think if you're an AGI optimist, you think that will get done before any of these genetically engineered humans grows up.
Do you need a dynamic and knowledgeable speaker for an event? Thomas Fry and me, Trent Fowler, are both seasoned keynote speakers, able to converse on a wide array of topics to audiences of all sizes and skill levels. Go to the contact page at futuratipodcast.com to book Thomas or myself today, and let us apply our years of experience in public speaking to make your event a smashing success. That's an interesting question.
Yeah, so I like to ask the question of what's the lifetime value of a superhuman. So we are able to flip all the right switches in this child being born. We create a super baby. It grows up to be a superhuman. Is it possible that the lifetime value of that person's $1 billion or multiple $1 billion, and that this is repeatable so that if it is, then countries get into a race to see who can create the most superhumans. Yeah, there's some science fiction story that's bound to get written about that fairly soon here.
Well, Ted Chiang's got several stories that are kind of in this vein that are really stories of our lives. If you've never checked that out, that's fantastic. It's got the most compelling description of a greater than human intelligence I've ever encountered, laid out in fiction.
Ted Chiang actually has a short story. I forgot the title of it. By the way, I interviewed Ted on my podcast. If your audience wants to hear that interview,
Manifold.
Yeah, we talk about some of these topics actually.
We'll link that. Yeah.
He's got one which is set in a future where there are, I think they're called metahumans. Anyway, they're engineered humans. And in that story, the metahumans are so good at science that humans, the old kind, can't follow what they're doing. Just have given up. And all the frontiers are being pushed forward by these metahumans. And the short story is actually about that. About how our kind just kind of gave up, like we just kind of gave up. And mostly what we try to do is reverse engineer the stuff that they do. Like, well, how the hell could that possibly work? And then we're trying to figure out how it works, So it's a little depressing, actually.
It's an interesting take on the super advanced alien civilization trope, where you get some artifact that fell off an alien spaceship and you kind of reverse engineer it and it powers industry for 50 years. In this case, it would be the same thing, only it's our grandchildren. It's these metahumans that we made and that escaped us. And now we not really sure what they're doing, but it's all great stuff. And we just kind of play with it. I'd still vote for that future if I had a choice over.
I would too, because, even if they're different from us, they're still also very like us. And that might even be true for AGIs, because the training data for AGIs will be human literature and human internet and human activities. So even though they're very different from us, like they're made of silicon and their intelligences may be really very alien to ours, in some ways they'll be like us, and they'll preserve a lot of our culture and ideas into the future. So if they take over and we, the wetware guys go away, I don't feel quite as nervous about that as some of the AI safety people.
Well, I think it would depend on the assumptions you're holding around which architecture is likely to yield a superintelligence. So the people I'm most familiar with, like Eliezer Yudkowsky, aren't super bullish on some ultra deep neural network achieving artificial general intelligence. He may have amended that. I mean, this is all about 10 years old. So like in light of recent advances, maybe he's amended that his priors. But last I looked into it, their favorite approach was more a de novo approach, like designing an algorithm from scratch that would bootstrap up to those levels. And of course it would interface with books and it would read our media and things like that. But the space of possible minds is very large, and you shouldn't a priori assume that wherever AGI emerges in that space will necessarily have an ethical architecture that is in any way consistent with what a human being.
Yeah, I wouldn't assume that they have a similar ethical architecture, but they may preserve our culture. They may not forget all the things that we did, and still be, and maybe their sense of aesthetics may even be such that they like some of the things that we did.
Informed by ours. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So are you an AGI optimist? Do you think you're gonna beat the AI folks in designing a super intelligence?
I think the jury's out. I think it's very hard to know. I guess lately I've been leaning toward AGI is going to come before the genetically engineered superhumans. There's a delay factor in which is the human generation time. So even if tomorrow I produce one of these babies that's off scale, it's still not going to be a fully functional adult. I mean, okay, maybe it's so smart it'll be off scale already by age 10 or something, but it won't be an adult for at least one generation time. So we've got that working against us. Whereas for the super confident AGI guys, they think we're only one human generation away from cracking it. So it's very hard for me to say. I guess I'm not. I know people who are far more optimistic about the pace at which we'll develop AGI than I am. I used to be much more pessimistic, but my posteriors have been moving in the more optimistic direction.
I was just reading recently about how transhumanism has kind of lost its luster because we've made so many breakthroughs that nothing seems all that shocking or important about transhumanism. And so we're almost there. So
as someone in the trenches, I would say, having worked on it for a while, I'm pretty confident we're going to get there. Lots of aspects of the genetic architecture that we've discovered just in the last 5 years are super favorable to transhumanism, and they didn't have to be that way. When we first started the research 10 years ago, we weren't sure things were going to come out in our favor, but they did. I can explain what I mean by that. But I'm quite optimistic about that transhumanism will definitely happen, because now we can, at least the science as we understand it now, seems to tell us it's very technically feasible. However, as someone in the trenches, I'm facing the opposition every day of people who don't want us to compute embryo health scores, don't want us to, would definitely not want us to ever edit a human embryo. I mean, there are many, many people like that are trying to hold back all this stuff. We're trying really hard to hold back this stuff.
If you could just make a 1 minute pitch for genetic engineering and why it's good, what would that pitch be?
I think that, okay, so this goes back to can I have more than 1 minute?
It's going on TikTok. You have 1 minute. We'll edit it. We'll edit it.
What we've learned in the last 5 years is that the limits to what we can achieve through genetic engineering are through the roof. So that it's not implausible to me that we could have humans whose natural lifespans are 200 years or more, whose average IQs are well over 200 or 300, if that has any meaning.
Right.
And, maybe could be engineered to be very happy and positive and ethical. All these things I think are possible. So to deny ourselves that just seems crazy.
Does that mean I could grow hair on my head again?
Yes.
Now
actually, I think they've solved that one. I think they know actually the biochemical pathways that cause baldness now. So anyway, long story.
Oh, that's amazing. What are some of the things that excite you most about genetic engineering? Like the frontiers of it. What are some of the developments ongoing now that really?
The thing I learned, which is actually it's not in the future, it's actually happening today, which I mentioned just recently, is that apparently if you give these hormonal treatments for egg extraction, egg stimulation, to young women, it's not unheard of. And I learned this by talking to people who actually run egg donor agencies. It's not unheard of to produce 60 or 100 eggs in one shot. So if you really were aggressive, if you were a billionaire and you were going to have 5 kids and you wanted the best 5 kids you could possibly get, and you say you were using an egg donor, you might be selecting from 100, 200, 300 embryos, each of which has a very detailed genetic score report.
Got a pretty good chance of getting somebody out on the right of the bell curve.
Yeah, you're feeding regression to the mean, and getting someone maybe to the right of yourself. And I think that's of interest to some of these billionaires. Well, I actually know it's of interest. So,
yeah.
So that's pretty exciting and right there.
Yeah. So last week we interviewed a gentleman who's working on mining asteroids, and he says that he views it's this problem of we live on an overpopulated Earth, but we live in a very underpopulated universe.
Yes.
And he thinks that we could have 1 trillion people in the universe, and
yeah, why not?
And we have lots of room out there. So
I think that.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
Yeah. So anyway, he's pushing for that type of a future, which is just goes cross-grain with most people's thinking about how crowded we are on Earth.
I think we're, if we ever now fusion is a difficult technology, but I think on, time scale of thousands of years, I'm pretty sure we would master fusion. I mean, thousands of years is a blink of an eye, right? In human evolutionary history, even in terms of human civilizations, not that long. Mm-hmm. We should master fusion, and even if we don't, the way that we're using fission is incredibly sad. Considering what people like Freeman Dyson or von Neumann thought of at the time when we first discovered nuclear energy. The use we put it to is very sad. Like, I thought we were, even in my youth, I thought we were going to have nuclear powered spaceships by now.
It's disappointing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very disappointing. But so if you think about, but if fusion in particular, I don't see why we couldn't expand all around the solar system, right? Why not, right? I mean, if you have that kind of energy source, why not, right? And we'll genetically engineer humans to deal better with zero gravity, for example.
So we're coming up onto the end of this episode, but we wanted you to give us a 1-minute overview of your thoughts on academia today.
Well, my 1-minute overview is the following. We have a very weird situation where it just happens that in America and in most countries, the leading edge basic research is primarily done at universities. I mean, of course, there are national labs and there are corporate research labs, but the bulk of leading edge researchers in STEM, physical sciences, computer science, biochemistry, are at universities. Those STEM scientists are afraid to speak up against a crazy woke takeover of their institution by people who are more concerned with social justice and leftist causes. Not that I'm against those things, okay, but they're only concerned with those things and much less concerned with discovering truth, discovering knowledge, and inventing new technologies. So it's a sad situation where some people might say, blow up the universities, the ideological capture of our universities is terrible. But you can't blow them up because the bulk of our best scientists and technologists are in there. But they're afraid to say anything because they're busy building the next quantum computer. They don't want to lock horns with some sociologist who's a labor activist. So that's the situation. I mean, I lived through these battles. I was a senior administrator for 8 years at a Big Ten university, and I could go on and on, but you only wanted a few minutes.
Yeah, well, that was perfect.
Well, excellent. Well, I don't want to end on a sad note like that. This has been a fascinating interview. It's one I've wanted to do for a long time. Is there anything you want to leave the audience with as we close up here?
I just want to say it's great talking to you guys. People, I think you guys use the term futurati, the people who are focused on the future, and there's no limit to what humans, and define broadly our descendants, whether they're silicon-based AGIs or genetically engineered humans. There is no limit to what we can accomplish in this universe. The universe is gigantic. It has ample resources, and we should never give up. We should never give up.
I love it. Thanks so much.
All right. There you have it.
We hope you enjoyed that lively and enlightening conversation with Dr. Steve Hsu. We're going to wrap up the episode now with me asking Thomas a tricky question, which he has to answer in 1 minute. Thomas, what do you think is the greatest promise of genetic engineering?
The greatest promise of genetic engineering is being able to increase human intelligence. And that's the area where there is no research dollars. He just told us that there's,
as we've just learned, $0.
$0, yes. And that's the most promising area in my mind. So there you have it. We have our conflict of the day.
There you have it. So if you like this episode, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and share it with your friends, and tune in next time.